Hi everyone. Today's mental health talk will be on what is OCD. That will be the general topic. Now, with any of the talks, I will go into a short disclaimer. These talks are intended to provide information and education only. They're not meant for diagnostic or treatment purposes. If you're experiencing some of the symptoms that I'm going to list, it doesn't mean you do or do not have OCD. If you're experiencing any of the symptoms though and are concerned or want more information, please visit a health professional in your local area. So that can be a doctor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, school counselor, etc. To get more information. Okay, so OCD is an abbreviation for obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, anecdotally, I would say OCD is one of the most mischaracterized and misunderstood psychological disorders in sort of public discourse. So a lot of people will have some idea of what depression is, maybe what the symptoms look like. A lot of people will have a very good idea of what anxiety involves. Most of the characterizations of OCD in the public are unhelpful and often incorrect. So, for the purposes of today, the most important thing, I think, is to clarify what OCD actually is. And then I will go through some examples and maybe a model later on as well to demonstrate what it might look like. So OCD often is quite secretive, and that's why there's a lot less perhaps information floating around about what the symptoms actually are and what kind of effect it has on people. A lot of people with OCD will keep it secret, even from family, from close friends, so that it often becomes a sort of hidden problem. And people are often embarrassed and ashamed to talk about their symptoms. So a lot of people who actually have it will appear to live very normal lives, at least from outside perspective. But when they're at home, when they're in private, they can be very distressed and report a lot of difficulties. So in answering the question of what is OCD, I wanted to start with what isn't OCD, because a lot of the portrayals in our everyday lives are unhelpful, as I said. So we're going to do a little bit of myth busting. So one of the myths quite commonly used around OCD is we're all a little OCD, or there will be examples of some celebrities, and I have some quotes. Celebrities coming out to say, well, I'm a little bit OCD here, I like things neat. Or another myth sort of related to this is that people with OCD are a little bit neurotic, a little bit uptight, or even that OCD is like a cute personality quirk. So here's a quote from Eminem. I have a slight bit of OCD, I think. I'm not walking around flipping light switches, but when I say I'm going to do something, I have to do it. Okay, not OCD at all. Has no relevance to OCD. That is a part of his personality, I guess, but that, it doesn't have any relevance to the disorder that is obsessive compulsive disorder. A quote from David Beckham: "I have got this obsessive compulsive disorder," he actually uses those words, "where I have to have everything in a straight line or everything has to be in pairs." Right? Now, unless the obsessions are so intense that he can't function without having to have things in a straight line or be in pairs, or he is not leaving the house until everything in the house is doing that, is taking up a significant amount of time. I mean, I'm going to go through the symptoms of OCD later, but the point is, these little personality quirks of needing something to be in pairs, needing something to be in a straight line, needing something to be neat or tidy, that is not OCD. Another myth: people with OCD are just neat freaks or germaphobes. So a quote from Kelly Clarkson: "I'm a hygiene freak. I'm like obsessive compulsive when it comes to washing your hands." Again, unless she's washing her hands to the point of perhaps, taking hours to do that, or to the point where her hands are bleeding. And the reason for that is because if she doesn't wash her hands, then there is a belief that something catastrophic will happen, like it will kill somebody if she touches them. That isn't OCD. Just because you like to be neat, just because you are like to wash your hands, just because you would be considered, what some people might call you a germaphobe, that is not enough to be OCD. Some other myths around OCD: people with OCD just have to learn to live with it. So the myth that you can actually learn to live with OCD, again, when I talk about some of the facts around OCD, it doesn't get better on its own. In the vast majority of cases, people with obsessive compulsive disorder diagnosed, without any kind of treatment, the prognosis is generally chronic, which means it does not get better on its own. Generally, the symptoms remain or get worse over time. And the last one I want to talk about is that people with OCD don't realize that they're acting irrationally. They do. Very often they do. Not everybody has good insight into their OCD, people who have it, but often, more often than not, people with OCD actually do realize that what they are doing is unhelpful. They realize it's too much, and yet they can't stop themselves. So here are a couple of quotes that I found that actually do describe OCD a little bit better. I wouldn't say they're perfect, but these. So the first one is: OCD focuses on the negative. I don't think to myself, my praying will save my grandma. Instead, I thought, if I don't pray, my grandma will die for sure. That's a little bit of insight into what someone might think. Another one: today my fiance's OCD hit a new low when she screamed at me for flicking the light switch off the wrong way. This led to her flicking it on and off about a dozen times, followed by a 20-minute lecture on how to do it properly. Now again, we don't know whether these people have been diagnosed with OCD, but these are the kinds of extremes that people with OCD can exhibit, and often it will be accompanied by very intense obsessive thinking, particularly around what happens if they don't do these behaviors. So What OCD actually is, it's a debilitating disorder characterized by obsessions and or compulsions. So sometimes there are solely obsessive-based versions of OCD. Often they will be accompanied, though, by compulsions, which are behaviors. And I'll talk about some examples later. So these obsessions and compulsions are almost always excessively time-consuming. So that's one of the criteria. And they need to cause significant distress or impairment to the point where you're either suffering in terms of the distress, or it's impacting significantly on some part of your life, your social life, your work, your relationships, that sort of thing. So the actual prevalence or rate of people who have OCD is estimated anywhere between sort of 2 and 5% of the population. 5% is a little bit on the high end, but it's an estimate sort of over a lifetime of people that might get it at some point. It's the 5th most disabling mental health condition and the 10th leading cause of disability. Usually begins in late childhood or adolescence, so around sort of 17, 18, 19 years old. Equal numbers of men and women experience OCD. As I said before, most people do not get better without treatment, so the course is quite chronic over time. Another unfortunate thing about people who suffer from OCD is because it's quite a secretive disorder, and a lot of people experience shame around it. People wait 6 up to 10 years often before seeking treatment. So it can already be quite entrenched before people, and quite debilitating before people start actually taking it seriously and seeking treatment. And it's often OCD is associated with other mental health disorders. So around half of people, depending on what research you take it from, around half of people with OCD will also have some kind of depressive disorder, for instance. And a large portion of people with OCD will have an anxiety-related disorder as well. So when we talk about obsessions and compulsions, because those are the two main components and criteria for OCD, what are we talking about? So in terms of obsessions, we're talking about recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, and images. Okay, so recurrent as in keeps coming back, persistent as in doesn't go away. So they can be thoughts, obsessive thoughts. It can be obsessive urges. These urges can be to act on something, to harm somebody. They can be sexual urges. They can be other types of antisocial or socially unacceptable behavior. Often those will be the thoughts and urges that are the obsessions in OCD. And these are almost always intrusive. So they appear and disappear from your mind without you really thinking about them. They will just appear. They're unwanted, or always unwanted, so they're never pleasant thoughts or urges. And they're almost always distressing. And what tends to happen is, because they're intrusive, because they're unwanted, because they're distressing, the person will attempt to ignore or suppress these thoughts, urges, or images. Or they will try to neutralize them with some other thought or action, usually by performing a compulsion. So, what are some examples of obsessions? Well, an example could be a fear around contamination or germs. So, a thought that germs are going to lead to the death of my family. Germs are going to make my family sick. Germs are going to harm me and my body, and they're going to kill me. So that's around contamination and germs. Thoughts about death or violent urges. So sometimes people will have thoughts around harming others. Now, this becomes tricky when, there is an actual present reality of them doing that. But the thoughts we're talking about here are just intrusive thoughts that flick into someone's mind, and they have no intention of ever acting on those thoughts. And yet, they take them seriously and will try and avoid anything around those thoughts. Thoughts about accidental or inadvertent harm are quite common. So if I drive my car, I'm going to have an accident. That thought might pop into your head, and then when you're driving, it keeps popping into your head. Some people have thoughts around, say, they've got their hand on the steering wheel, and then they just have a sudden urge to pull left, right, into a tree or into oncoming traffic. And the thing about obsessions is the thoughts themselves, the intrusive thoughts, are not uncommon at all. A large percentage of people have intrusive thoughts occur to them. So we'll talk about the model later as to why these become obsessive and why they become a problem in people with OCD. More examples of obsessions: fear of engaging in social unacceptable behavior, need for order and symmetry, unwanted sexual thoughts, unwanted blasphemous thoughts or doubts. But again, I'll go through some more concrete examples later when we go through the model. So, compulsions. What are compulsions? Well, when you have these unwanted thoughts, what some people might choose to do is try and perform actions that somehow suppress or neutralize these thoughts or urges. Right? So, if a person has an obsessive thought about germs, they might, a sort of classic example is the compulsion might be, well, I will wash my hands. I will set an alarm, perhaps every 5 minutes I'm going to wash my hands, and I'm going to do it for 2 minutes. Or I'm going to have to check whether the doorknob is locked, and I'm going to do that repeatedly over and over again for the next 6 hours, and I won't be able to sleep because of that. Because of the thought of someone coming into the home and you having left the door unlocked and that person murdering your whole family. Right? So these are examples of what actually can go on in people's heads, and the types of behaviors, the extent to which they can go to try and neutralize these thoughts. So common compulsions include things like washing and checking behavior. So the two examples I've had before, washing your hands, checking the doorknob or locks, cleaning behavior, counting behavior, ordering behavior, praying behavior. Compulsions can include all of these. But of course, as I said before, it's not doing it once or twice. It's not being a little bit quirky about these. It's doing them over and over and over again to the point where even though you realize it's unrealistic, it's taking up all of your time, and potentially it's impacting your ability to work, to raise your children, to function in your relationships, you still have to do it. That's where it gets into the territory of real OCD. Compulsions can be observable, so hand washing, or they can be hidden. So the counting, some people report counting in their heads, repeating words silently, praying, all of those kinds of behaviors we may not necessarily be able to see in somebody who is doing them. And there is also a type of compulsion where it's, now this one's a little bit tricky, but it's reassurance seeking. So, checking in with others, asking repeatedly, are you sure this is okay? Are you sure I locked the door? Are you sure the house isn't going to burn down? Are you sure I have washed enough? Are you sure the germs aren't going to kill the kids? This can be... there's a fine line, of course, because reassurance seeking is something that people do in everyday life. As are many of these other activities like washing your hands and checking if your door is locked. So the reassurance seeking has to be quite over the top and perhaps annoying people to the point of impairing their ability to socialize and that sort of thing. So I'm going to bring up a model now. This is a model that's not maybe too commonly used with OCD, but because OCD is my research area, this is a model that I think is quite useful, and it's research-based as well. So, what often happens with people is, so the trigger and intrusion parts of this model happen to everybody. And that's probably the biggest takeaway. And also the part that often people with problematic OCD don't understand until they go through perhaps some treatment. That doubts about safety, about your memory, concerns about harm, and intrusive thoughts happen to everybody. So if you think about a doubt like, oh, maybe I haven't locked the house. Did I lock the house? I don't remember. Or did I lock my car? I don't really remember. Did I turn the heater off? Right? Did I turn the heating off? Did I turn the all the power points off? Maybe they'll start a fire. I know that can happen. Did I leave the stove on? Right? In terms of gas. If you suddenly are in a car park and let's say you go to a level and then you find that your car's not there. Some people experience the anxiety of, oh, did my car get stolen? Or have I forgotten where I've parked my car, right? So self-doubt is normal. And for a lot of us, we can manage with uncertainty and with doubt. So if we're halfway to the airport and our flight leaves soon, and we suddenly have a thought to say, hey, did I turn off the stove? Most of us would be confident enough in ourselves and have a small enough level of self-doubt to say, I'm pretty sure I did, and continue on the way to the airport, rather than, for instance, turning around, going back home, checking, and it was turned off, and then missing your flight. But for someone with OCD, that's complete. That would be completely normal, and for them, that would be completely part of their thinking to say, I have to do whatever it takes to get home to check now. And the problem is, it's not just once, because once you've checked, okay, then you leave the house again, you're again halfway to the airport, intrusive thought might come up again. Right? Did I turn the knob fully, or did I only turn it a little bit? Did I check every appliance? What about the door? Did I leave it unlocked? I locked it the first time, maybe I didn't lock it the second time. So these are some of the things that, some of the differences between how someone with OCD can think and someone, I guess, without OCD might think. So the trigger in terms of having that situation happen to you is often normal, as are the intrusions. So the first two parts of the model, even though, even with, for us, for people who don't have OCD, you will also have intrusive thoughts. They often don't progress to the third part, to appraisal. So, or the appraisal is benign or positive. So examples of some intrusive thoughts. While driving, impulse to run the car off the road, as I said before. In research, 64% of women, 53% of men, just across the population, have said they've had those. And they've had those thoughts frequently. Right, you're just driving along, and then suddenly you think, oh, what would it be like if I... Having that thought doesn't mean anything. But to people with OCD, often having those thoughts does mean something about them or about what they need to do. As I said, did I leave the heating, stove, or lights on so that it could cause a fire? Right, that intrusive thought. 79% of women, 62% of men have reported having those across the general population, and yet only maybe 2% of people have OCD. So, the majority of people have intrusions, and we appraise them to be, it's fine. There's no need to worry about that. It's not a big deal. Oh, it's just a thought that popped into my head. I can very easily discard that thought as something I would never do, something that might be ridiculous, irrational. I could get a sexually transmitted disease from touching a toilet seat or handle. Again, large portions of the population said, yep, we've thought about that before. Right. You actually, but just by touching, that's not how sexually transmitted diseases work. So you are very unlikely to to get an STD from simply using a public restroom. And yet, again, for people who have OCD, and if for them that is part of their obsession, that is a real concern for them. Feel a sudden impulse. So I'm just going to go through some of these. Feel a sudden impulse to say something rude or insulting to a friend, even though I'm not angry at them. Impulse to say or do something rude to a stranger that I'm just walking past. When driving, the thought of running over pedestrians or animals. More than half of males said, yep, I've had that thought. The thought of having sex with an authority figure. So the thought of having sex with your boss. 55% of women, 67% of men said, yep, I've had that thought. I have had that intrusive thought when looking at an authority figure, whether it be my boss or whatever. Again, intrusions are quite normal. The problem seems to be, from the research, in the difference in the way that people appraise those intrusive thoughts. Just because you have a thought doesn't mean anything, but for some people, putting a lot of meaning into having those thoughts and then needing to take action to mitigate becomes a problem. and very quickly through the rest. Impulse to indecently expose myself. When talking to people, intrusive thoughts of being naked. When I see a sharp knife, the thought of cutting myself or somebody else, unrelated to actual self-harm. And in general, when in a public place, the thought of becoming dirty or contaminated from touching, for instance, a doorknob or just a very benign object. All of these happen to a large portion of people, these thoughts. So the difference generally, if we move to the third part of the model, is in appraisal. It's in how we think about ourselves when we have these thoughts, when we have these intrusive thoughts. So, as an example, the trigger is either going out of the house or going to sleep. The intrusion might be an urge. The urge to check light switches, the urge to check the stove to see there's no gas running. Or there might be a intrusive thought. So a doubt. Did I leave something open? What if I left the gas on? Well, that's going to kill my whole family slowly while I sleep. As you're leaving to go out, if you're already halfway to your destination, intrusive thought pops in. What if I left the stove on and it burns down the whole house? Now, the appraisal part of what I was talking about is that having the thought means it's true. So that's a possibility. Or, so if I've thought it, it will happen. I am the one responsible for making sure this never happens. I am responsible for my family's safety. I must act, otherwise I will lose control. All of these are unhelpful appraisals. That, again, most people won't have. Most people will have those intrusions, and then the appraisal might be, it'll probably be okay, I'm sure I turned the stove off. Or 9 times out of 10 I do it, and also I think my partner would have known. So instead of taking sole personal responsibility, I think my partner would probably know if I didn't turn the stove off. I think we probably would have smelt the gas if I left the stove, on the entire night and gas was leaking. Someone probably would have smelt it. It's unlikely for that to happen. What are the chances? Probability is quite low. And even if we do have an urge to go and check, for many of us, checking once is enough, right? Or even at the most, checking twice, and then you go to bed. So our response in the end might be quite short, quite reasonable, but for somebody with OCD, the response will often be what we would consider quite overboard. Often it will be obsessing over the thought over and over again, getting worked up about it, getting very anxious. The response might be, as I said before, the compulsion, so checking behavior. If you're about to go to sleep, oh, did I leave the stove on? Is there gas leaking out? Okay, get up, go to the stove, check, turn every knob on and off, make sure you don't hear anything as well, go to bed. 5 minutes later, you're still not asleep. Did I leave the stove on? Is there gas coming out? Bang, you're up again. and some people might do that for hours. While being tired, while being, needing to get up early, for instance, and they even might understand that what they're doing is not rational, and yet they still have to act on those urges. As I said before, so some people will seek reassurance, excessively asking, for instance, if they're on a trip with a friend, right? They're already on the plane, and the entire, 10-hour plane ride, they're asking their friend, "Hey, do you think I turned off the stove? Do you think my house is going to burn down? What do you think? Do you think that's going to happen? I think that's going to happen. Do you think I can ask the pilot to turn the plane around?" So that's one example of the differences as we go through the model. I'll go through another one. So the trigger might be just seeing let's say seeing a syringe. Maybe even at a doctor's clinic, or you might see one discarded around in the neighborhood. The intrusive thought immediately might be, well, that's dangerous. But also, what if someone I know steps on that? What if I fall into that? What if someone pushes me and I fall into that? Now, the contamination examples are a little bit different because some of us don't have those intrusive thoughts at all. We might disregard them, and that might be our response to appraise it as dangerous. But our response might be, well, I'm just going to avoid it. It's not a big deal. It's not my responsibility, perhaps. But for somebody with OCD, the appraisal might be, again, if I've thought about it, it's likely to happen. I must do everything in my power. I'm responsible for this situation, for mitigating this situation. I don't have control over the situation. So the response might be, pick it up, put it in a bin, and then suddenly you're back to being very anxious, needing to wash all the time. Maybe you go obsessively call your doctor and to get reassurance. Does touching the end of a syringe carry any risks? Are you sure? How many times do I need to wash my hands in order to clean this? What if I touch the car door and then my child touches the car door? Will they get contaminated? Maybe I need to wash the whole car now. I need to disinfect the doorknob because I touched them on the way home. I need to disinfect my keys. What about my clothes? So this is what OCD might look like for someone who has it. Now, in terms of these appraisals, often the appraisals don't necessarily mean, again, as I said with that example, right? Sometimes the appraisals are actually realistic. So sometimes, not always, negative appraisals are not always issues. But when the negative appraisals lead to behaviors, or you go back to your obsessions and it leads to something like anxiety, ramping up your anxiety, to a very distressing or very debilitating and impairing level, that's where you could consider somebody to have OCD. That's where a professional would consider somebody to have OCD. So again, just because you have intrusive thoughts. Just because a situation might trigger you to have urges, and even sometimes if you appraise those to be meaningful, to be dangerous, as long as that you're still acting rationally, generally that's okay. So as I said before, with the examples of, maybe you've heard people around you say, oh, I have a little bit of OCD. I'm a little bit OCD because I'm a neat freak. I'm a little bit OCD because I'm a germaphobe, right? Those will be people who have maybe some intrusive thoughts around needing something to be sequential, needing something to be perfect, needing some things to be very neat, needing the house to be neat, right? If my house is not neat, people will criticize me. That's an intrusive thought. It may be that they appraise that to be more important than perhaps many people would. But if that appraisal is not causing a response that leads to very significant distress or impairment, often or almost always that's not OCD. That's not obsessive compulsive disorder. So I just wanted to, one of the big points of this talk is to make it abundantly clear that a lot of the examples and the use of the word OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder in the general population is quite mischaracterized, unhelpful, and incorrect. Having said all that, I do want to repeat the disclaimer that these talks, they're intended to be informative, they're intended to be educational, but they are not meant for diagnosis or treatment purposes. Just because you're experiencing some of the symptoms that I've talked about doesn't mean you have OCD. And if you're experiencing some of those symptoms and are concerned or want more information, please visit a health professional in your local area. Now, in terms of finishing off with a quote, there's not a lot of good quotes, unfortunately, about OCD online because, as I said, OCD is so often mischaracterized. And there's a lot of flippancy about OCD, about using it quite in ways that don't really represent how serious a condition it is. So I tried finding some humorous quotes, as I usually try to do to end these talks with, and I couldn't really find any. So the one piece of sort of writing that I could find on OCD that I liked was this: let go of intrusive thoughts. Recognize the thought, be aware of it without judging it. Don't fight the thought, because this will make it stronger. Distance yourself. Remind yourself that the thought is nothing more than a thought. It does not define you. You don't have to act on it. Allow yourself some time. You can do this. Believe in yourself. Okay, so I just want to credit finally the Center for Clinical Interventions, where I get a decent chunk of my information for many of my talks, although not actually for this one. They are a specialist clinical psychology service supported by the Western Australian Government. Their website is cci.health.wa.gov.au. Thanks for listening, and the next psych talk should be on what is hoarding. So if you're interested in hoarding, please tune into that one. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.